Live from the Washington, D.C. area, all empowered citizens need to know about intelligent use of resources, smart governance, inclusive communities, smart industry, and healthy, thriving urbanization. This is Smart Sustainability, the TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. Welcome on Smart Sustainability. Energy, or the lack hereof, is cracking the world order of the past. But it's not energy per se, but much more failed policies, lack of competence in politics and governments, lack of foresight and planning, and being caught in ideologies versus feasibility and understanding of how sustainability, and we're talking real sustainability, not buzzwords, really works, what it is and what it's based on. The energy crisis is hitting all of us, some countries more than others. It shows the difference between sustainability and plain ideology that's rolled out on people. Germany right now is getting in the thick of it, a classic example of how ideology and ideological and government endanger the very thing they set out to do, contributing to a sustainable planet. And while it's not ideologies that can get us to a way of life that's more in tune with nature. In fact, as it turns out, ideologies such as the green dogma may not even get us through this winter, the way this looks. Germany is grappling with exactly that. The situation is dire. Energy, how energy can be made sustainable versus taking the ideological path, our topic tonight. Good evening, thanks for joining me. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. Over the years, when working with living organisms, I've observed that anything sustainable is ideology-free. That's why it sustains. Nature is the best example. It's been around for 4 billion plus years for a reason. It constantly changes and adapts. It follows an invisible hand, universal laws that are shared by every living organism. Life and death are closely linked. As a matter of fact, they're part of the same cycle. I know that's difficult for us to grasp, but that's the paradox of eternity, constant change and renewal, and the mystery of sustainability. We see that in nature, in the 4 seasons. We see it at the change of night and day, every day actually. Ideologies, on the contrast, all begin to fail the moment they become dogmatic. Now, why is that? Because when they become dogmatic, they become static, the very opposite of constant change and renewal, thus the opposite of sustainability. Think of a stagnant pond. It turns, gets murky, and dies. You could see that very same pattern, the death of dogma in communism, in fascism. You can see that in smaller doctrines that are present in your own life. Most of us have some sort of dogma present in their lives. Dogma means static, and static has no renewal aspect to it. So what does that have to do with energy or the energy crisis? Well, when we look at living organisms like nature is, the human being, or any form of life, change is always a gradual process in close collaboration with all other factors and participants in the ecosystem. The collaboration, the whole system's perspective, is the key word here. If you change just one tiny thing, everything else changes. So when we don't look at all these aspects, it gets messy. The current German government took over under Olaf Scholz. They put their green agenda at top, not thinking for a moment of the consequences and how other participants may be affected, and how that in turn would affect the overall situation. Getting out of nuclear power and coal right now was the priority. No matter that, Germany is an industrial society, mostly energy dependent on Russia, and without Russia's gas and price reliability on gas, companies can't produce. Now we're talking butchers, bakers, craftsmen, chemical industry, porcelain industry, you name it. All of them are affected. Businesses that have been around for 120 plus years are shutting down in record numbers because gas prices have gone through the roof and have become the main production cost driver, making it practically unaffordable to produce. Green ideology, of course, doesn't understand any of that. As Germany's green economic minister demonstrated multiple times, and just lately, by saying that, oh, it's not so bad. Companies can simply stop production and reopen sometime later. Huh? you might say? Well, most of us said exactly that. He didn't understand how gas, energy prices, production, selling goods, paying staff, and thus making a living through real, actual work are connected, not to speak of the social impact. In Germany right now, September 2022, every third company is fearing having to close, according to the BDI, the Bund der Deutschen Industrie. Last February, 23% of companies were fearing for their existence. Currently, though, that number rose already to 34% who are battling to stay in business. And that's before the winter. Almost every 10th business has already reduced production or interrupted their production. Every fourth company is considering moving abroad. Now remember, Germany is the center of Europe. It's the largest economy in Europe and the fourth largest in the world. Trouble in Germany's industry means trouble for everyone. Add to that the danger of the Ukraine war that the green ideology, interestingly enough, so vehemently defends instead of doing what would be pragmatic, makes sense and actually help the planet, negotiating for peace. So we don't have a nuclear war, don't have to go back to coal and who knows what. Now, we don't have to go all the way overseas to see how plain blind ideology without any knowledge of how things are connected is unsustainable. The Texas energy grid breakdown last year showed us the flaws of our own green ad hoc approach. And don't get me wrong, I love sustainability. I live by it. In fact, we're doing a show about it. But there's a discrepancy between ideology and the need to become closer in tune with nature, economically, environmentally, socially, and in a way it all makes sense. That we need to do that is out of question. Nature is calling us to reconnect, and we better heed that call. Now, how we do that, though, is heavily debatable. Systems thinkers and ideologists have clashing opinions on that, because systems thinkers look at how we can get to a sustainable approach in a holistic, pragmatic, and thoughtful way versus the we must do this now and think about the consequences later, or not at all, as it turns out in Germany's politics right now. There's also a discrepancy about what energy solutions are available and what governments pursue and how they do that. The energy crisis, though, may be pushing us to a turning point, away from political ideology and more towards a feasible sustainability in tune with who we really are as humans, namely part of nature. Now, we had several episodes last year on energy, how we could revolutionize it, what could be good approaches and possible solutions. While last year, most of the discussion was still hypothetical, today we're facing exactly these issues. Watch. Joining us tonight are a bunch of guests that approach energy and sustainability from different angles. We got Peter Sorensen, president of Systems Roundtable, an organization that helps organizations and society approach complexity from a systems thinking point of view. We have Ted Trabu, director of the District of Columbia Sustainable Energy Utility. Prior to his current position, he was VP for District of Columbia Affairs at PEPCO. We got John Rosebush, president of Worldwide Development Corporation, who says he has an invention that can provide 90% of the planet's energy needs without human intervention. He comes from the oil industry and changed his profession to follow his passion, finding better forms of energy that are sustainable in the future. He's challenging the United Nations with his invention we're going to hear more about. We got Neil Samuels, co-founder of the People-Powered Innovation Collaborative, an organization that aims to elevate the ability of ecosystems and organizations to create a world that works for all. He's a geologist with a heavy oil background, having worked for BP and Amoco, among others. Urgency to review the energy concepts that we have currently is becoming, I think at this point, probably clear to everybody, whether you've been affected by what happened or not. So let's talk about, to start out with, in terms of what is our current energy landscape? What's out there? John, you want to take a stab at this?
Well, right now we have somewhat of a national grid. It's mostly powered by coal still today. Where natural gas has really come on board, and there's much more power generation from natural gas. We're trying to bring on wind and solar. There is problems throughout. We're consuming still limited resources. So we're not there. We're not even close to being where we need to be long term. If we continue down this path, we know that it affects climate change, but more importantly, what I'm more concerned about is the oil consumption around the world. We're consuming now close to 34 billion barrels a year. And we cannot, this is not sustainable. If we take a look at the oil reserves remaining, BP predicts 47 years, but we know we're going to find more oil and have better recovery methods. But we're going to run out of oil. We cannot drill our way out of this problem. Even the North Pole, they said once it melts, the predictions are there's 90 billion barrels up there.
Yeah, but hang on, I want to get back to how sustainable this all is, but to start out with, I really like to give our viewers an overview in terms of the current landscape, what we have. So we know there's a shortage of oil. We know we're going to run out of it. I want to move on to Ted here for a second. From a consumer point of view, what's the current landscape? What does it look like, Ted?
The consumers are in a very difficult position. And I think you have residential consumers and then you have commercial consumers who are in very fundamentally different positions in and of themselves. We moved to a deregulated market nationally almost 2 decades ago. And I think that it has proven in some respects to have worked out for commercial consumers. But when you look at some of the residential consumers in Texas, getting monthly bills in excess of $7,000 to $10,000, one might argue that it didn't work out necessarily for the residents. We've had a deregulated market here in the District of Columbia for 20 years, but only 20% of the residential customers have even found their way to a competitive supplier. So it's a very, very different set of fundamentals and dynamics, and the commercial customers are benefiting significantly from the deregulated market, whereas I think residential customers, by and large, haven't seen similar benefits.
So, Pete, I want to move on to you. From a systemic point of view, our current landscape, where are we at?
Well, it's interesting, Nicolette. We're not looking at things from an ecosystem or systems-based point of view. An example of that would be here in Texas. You've alluded to our situation where we had the polar vortex come down and we lost power in most of Texas. In the ERCOT controlled grid area of Texas, we lost power. The demand went way up. The ability to generate went down, and ERCOT had to go ahead and cut power to much of the state. As a result of that cutting of power, water treatment systems went off, and as a result of that, people lost clean water. And so that was a systems connection that was affected that had not been anticipated well before that. Oh, but pardon me, we had anticipated it because in 2011, we had a very similar circumstance with a polar vortex come down. And recommendations were made. You've got to winterize the system. You've got to ensure generation capacity. You've got to ensure distribution capacity. You've got to make sure that all of the ancillary stuff like water purification is available to the citizens so that the citizens can have both power and water. So it was anticipated. And oh, by the way, El Paso, which is not on the same grid, it's on the Western Interconnection grid, fared much better. They winterized. They invested after 2011 in winterization, and they brought up a new plant. And when the demand increased because of the cold weather, they were able to get power from the nuclear plant over west of Phoenix, Arizona. And so they basically had 5-minute outages, whereas we had days of outages. And so we were not honoring the system interconnectedness in the way we designed or the way we managed the systems in Texas.
Yeah, which really is kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, that we had similar issues before and nobody picked up on that. But I want to move on here to Neil for a second. From the practical point of view, where do you see the current landscape right now? I mean, you've worked in the oil industry, similar like John. John's also coming from an oil background. So where are we? Where do you see us at this point?
Well, I'm fascinated by the transition from the oil economy to the green economy, the sustainable economy. It's clearly coming. It's coming faster than I think anybody ever expected. I can remember years ago at BP, well, there's no demand for electric vehicles. And of course, it comes. But how you handle that transition, to me, requires that ecosystem perspective. If I want to give you one specific example. In one respect, it's a success story, and it's Danish Oil and Natural Gas. They did call themselves Dong, so I'll use that as the shorthand. And in 2012, Dong was one of the most coal-intensive companies in Europe, dirty power production. And they also had an oil and gas group. And last year, I want to get this right, they ranked as the world's most sustainable energy company in Corporate Knights 2021 index. They now control, I think, 30% of the global market of offshore wind. Great success. They've moved from dirty coal to, I think, 97% of their energy now comes from offshore wind and biomass. Great story. Well, I was working with their oil and gas group in 2015. A new CEO came in for that group. I think his main purpose was to get this oil and gas business in a position where it could be sold. That was Dong's goal, to shed, they called it the black part of the business. They had their green part and their black part. So the CEO, Henrik Paulsen, was the Dong head. And when the deal closed in 2017, by the way, they sold the oil and gas group to Ineos, a private chemical company, not known for their environmental and sustainability practices. So in some respect, Dong is a success story. They are now a green company. But in reality, all they did was externalize this oil and gas group. They're still producing oil the old way. They didn't really make a change in that part of the business because it's not theirs anymore. It now belongs to Ineos. And I compare that with what I've seen BP do recently. And disclaimer, I used to work for them. And I remember in 2000 when John Brown committed, we are going to reduce our CO2 production 10% from 1990 levels in 10 years. And people thought he was crazy. Shook up the industry. How could you do that? Guess what? They met the goal in 4 years. And I look at what they've done now and their mission. I want to get their purpose. We deliver heat, light, and mobility products and services to people all around the world in ways that will help drive the transition to a lower carbon future. They have 3 strategic elements: get to net zero as a company by 2050 or sooner, and help the world to get to net zero, improve people's lives, and care for our planet. So they've taken their oil and gas business and they've said, we're going to do it differently. Because we know we need, as John said, we know we're going to have an oil economy for the short term, the shorter the better. And we're going to invest heavily in renewables, in hydrogen, in solar, in wind. So I like that approach, recognizing the reality that we still need hydrocarbon, but we can't produce it, deliver it, and think about the long-term impact the way we always have. So I'd like more organizations to take that ecosystem perspective rather than just their own organization and say, how can we change this whole ecosystem to make it sustainable, to benefit all of the stakeholders rather than just shareholders? So I'm very hopeful when you have a company like BP devoting the resources, and Shell followed suit. Exxon, we'll see. But I'm more hopeful that we will manage this transition better than I thought we could 5 years ago. There's so much pressure in the big system now.
Yeah, well, I guess if we have more impact and more storms like the one we just had in Texas, that gets a lot of people going real quickly, I think, in moving into the right direction. I want to talk about, for a second, in terms of sustainability. So you all come from that field, so you probably all have a very distinct definition of how you would define sustainability, and then also how you would define how sustainable our current different landscape really is. So just a brief overview for our viewers and for the audience, which I'm sure, you know, if you ask yourself probably at home, you're going to wonder, how do you actually define sustainability? So I want to dive in. How do you define sustainability? John, what's your take on that?
Well, first I want to discuss Europe's conversion to wind energy.
I know. I want to discuss first the definition of sustainability.
Oh, something that you can do that will last forever. I look at it as a permanent solution, not temporary solutions like, you know, to go to natural gas and then use that as a platform to go to the next technology. I look at sustainability as something that you can do permanently. Permanently,
okay. And that, of course, takes all what you said, like the oil shortages and all the dwindling resources in consideration.
Well, that takes in consideration the oil reserves. We're going to run out of them. This isn't the 1970s. So we cannot depend on oil long term. And by the way, 30% of the oil consumed in the United States is to make products, not for energy. So we need to have oil long term. And the reason being is we cannot support 7.6 billion people without oil, without plastics. Even though plastics are not good for the environment, we need plastics. Look around. The entire world is made up of plastics. So that's one thing. But everything that we do, we should be recycling plastics in mass around the world. We should no longer have single-use plastics. So there's things that we need to do as a planet to create sustainability. The two things I would say is we need to be able to power this planet without consuming resources, and we need to be able to recycle all oil products to preserve that oil for future generations. Mm-hmm. Everything else is a moot point if we don't do that. We will not have a sustainable planet for humanity going forward.
Mm-hmm. Ted, what's your take on this?
I would agree with what John is saying, but I would add a little bit to it as well. We've had this discussion about oil. I would put natural gas in the mix as well. Here in the District of Columbia, we are talking about our long-term goals for carbon neutrality by 2050. And a tenet of those goals is moving away from natural gas, which currently is the mainstay for heating our water and our homes here in the District of Columbia. And you have the largest user here in the city, clearly the federal government, using natural gas, the largest consumer of natural gas in the region as well. So, you know, I would add natural gas and decarbonization to those sustainability efforts. Mm-hmm. We are driving on what I call the demand side, not the supply side necessarily, but the demand side as well, to help people reduce the amount of energy that they need to consume by putting in more efficient products in their homes, in their buildings, so that they don't need as much of any energy as we move forward towards our goals of carbon neutrality.
Trent, I would say all fossil fuels fit in that category, not just natural gas,
oil and natural gas. Yeah, and we understand our grid in this region is heavily dependent on coal, oil, and natural gas to fire the generators that are supplying the energy to the city. But we're chipping away at it. There's no silver bullet. It's going to be a long-term effort.
Well, Trent, there's 500 gigawatts of electricity that's added to this world every year. And most of that is coming from third world countries and is coal. And so we're not actually even keeping up with demand through the use of wind and solar, by the way.
Okay, so that actually brings up something that I wanted to discuss later, but since you already sort of jumped into that, I want to talk a little bit about what's feasible, a systemic approach versus an ideology approach, because that seems to me, some people say we want to do the switch right away to get to green energy and renewables and so on, and others say we can't really do it quite yet. So I'm going to start with Pete. Can you give us your perspective on what's the best way actually, or the most, from a systems perspective, what do we have to keep in mind to make the shift and go into more sustainable energies and sustainable energy usage that we have, versus ideology who just says, we all need to go green tomorrow?
That's an interesting issue, because sustainability is a multivariate problem. It's not just the environment, as in the physical environment, but it's also, we have to look at what's sustainable financially, what's sustainable in terms of people, what's sustainable in terms of the political environment, and what's sustainable in terms of technology and innovation. And right now, what we see is that in Texas, we do not have sustainability in terms of taxation, because we cannot make the changes to our existing systems that are necessary to prevent a recurrence of what we've just experienced with the polar vortex unless we increase some taxes and allocate those funds to accomplish the modernization and winterization that we have. And
but how
so
can you
if we
increase
just hold to
taxes?
ideology.
But how can you increase taxes if you don't really know which system you're going to move towards?
Well, I think part of the issue is that it's a complex mix of factors in terms of how you provide energy. And it's a dynamic changing process that has to be managed as a multi-factor ecosystem-based process. So for instance, one example of that is that we need to get more energy available in Texas. If Texas maintains the ERCOT grid that's cut off from all the other grids, then that means that there would be a huge investment that would have to be done in Texas to be able to maintain our total independence. And that's not a sustainable solution, but ideologically it is. We have to be able to figure out, both on a pragmatic basis and on a scientific basis, how we move forward. And it's not going to be easy. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
But Peter, you raise a fascinating point. I mean, I look at our jurisdiction here. We don't have any baseload generating in the District of Columbia.
Okay.
So we are dependent on bringing in from the surrounding states and reliant on the grid. We are trying to reduce our reliance from the grid on the demand side by going into buildings, by going into homes and reducing energy consumption. That's going to help us break our reliance on the grid, as well as the installation of renewable energy systems here in the District of Columbia and in nearby areas, so that we can get more into a sustainable future. I mean, I think it's, you're talking about the supply side, but I think it's equally important to talk about the demand side. And so what we did was we put a public benefits surcharge, we don't like to call it a tax, on everybody's utility bill to help us fund these investments. You're absolutely right. None of this will come free.
Yes.
But Ted,
We will have to raise revenues to make the investments that are necessary. But the question becomes, are you going to attack exclusively the supply side, or do you equally want to approach the demand side as well? And that's where I'm saying I like working on the demand side of the economic.
so Ted, in your case, what exactly are you doing when you say you reduce the demand side, you go into people's homes? Explain to us what that looks like.
From the most basic replacement, helping our residents buy high efficient light bulbs, buy LED bulbs. Lighting is 20% of the energy usage in your typical home. So you replace all of the incandescent bulbs with LED bulbs, and then you go and help the residents we help them buy down the cost of those bulbs. We help them buy down the cost of high efficient air conditioning systems, furnaces, water heaters, and the like, so that they can reduce energy in their homes. Similarly, you go to a larger building, we would take our engineers in there and help engineer solutions to reduce energy consumption throughout the building, through lighting, changing out lighting controls, teaching people oftentimes how to use the systems that they have more efficiently than they're currently operating. Some of our schools are very old here. Some of our buildings are very old. And the legacy systems that have been in place, there's you can turn it on 100% or you can turn it off. And there's not much in between.
Yeah.
Showing people how to regulate what they have in their hands is helping. We teach a course called Building Operator Certification.
But I was going to
help
say,
people reduce their energy significantly.
Yeah, I was going to say, that seems to me, though, there's also a heavy educational part involved with that.
You're absolutely right, Nicolette. There's a big educational piece to it.
Yeah.
But we feel that that is even less expensive than replacing the entire system in the building. And so, there are ways that you can approach the demand side of this that aren't as expensive as replacing the entire systems.
Can I make a quick comment?
Sure.
Please.
You guys are looking at it at a micro level. I'm looking at it at a macro level. Can you imagine us having to tell our grandchildren, hey, we would have created a sustainable planet for you, but we couldn't afford to save ourselves? So when I look at this situation, I look at it completely on a macro level. The idea that we save pennies here, pennies there means absolutely nothing. We may have to change our monetary policy to get this done, but we need to look at it on a macro level. Otherwise, billions and billions of people are going to lose their lives.
I couldn't agree with you.
I kind of disagree. You have to look at that macro level, but it starts at a micro level. If you're not approaching the micro level, you're missing a huge part of the equation.
Well, I hope.
Okay, hold on. Let's bring Neil in here. So, Neil, you said you quite agree on the macro level. Go.
And I agree on both. I mean, this is not an either-or conversation or an either-or dilemma. This
it's an either and or, right?
It's a both. It's a both and.
Yes.
And I love taking it up to the real high macro level. Is how do we reimagine capitalism? Milton Friedman really did a number on us that it's all about shareholder value. That's what's I think, in part destroyed our planet. So how do we change that mindset? That's as big as you can get. Because when I look at sustainability, I love David Cooperrider's definition. It's what we try to do in our organization. How to create a world where economies, businesses, and all people thrive, and nature flourishes now and across the generations. So what do we have to do to reimagine our economies, to reimagine and reinvent our businesses, the purpose they have in the world, their business models and operating models? How do we take people into account in every decision we're making? It's not people or profit. It's not shareholder or stakeholder. It's not market forces or global trends. It's all of it. Yeah. And as long as we keep all of those in mind, as we love radical stakeholder participation.
Okay, where
Everybody
do we start?
needs to be involved in those conversations to figure out what's it going to mean, what can we start doing at all the levels to bring about what we need.
Well, don't we agree we have two categories of sustainability? One is social, which you brought up. 10% of the people own and 90% of the wealth, unsustainable. But we also have a physical science that's causing unsustainability too. So we have two different major issues.
I can't separate them.
Okay, so where do we start? So when we know it's a huge, the complexity is tremendous. We know there's a micro level, there's a macro level, there are all these different components to it, and everyone who works in the various components always think that their area is the most important one to start with. So realistically, from a systems point of view, where's the starting point?
The starting point has to be
changing the mindset a little bit.
I got Pete. Yes, please.
Mindset a little bit and convincing people that you won't have this is economic shift won't cause massive job losses. One of the things that we've had to do here, and you call me micro if you want to, but before our energy goals, we set up economic development goals. The creation of jobs for residents here, the creation of business opportunities for businesses here to get into this new economy. That's what allowed us politically to even put the surcharge on the utility bills. The residents and the businesses had to be convinced, it's called that WIFM, what's in it for me? They had to be convinced there was something in it for them before they would allow any of this to move forward. And I think that's a critical component of it.
Trent, I totally agree with you.
But I want to bring Pete back on because he also had something to add on this one.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a multi-front war. Just like in World War II, we had a Pacific theater and a European theater and an African theater and so forth. That's what we've got to do now. And so what Ted is saying, work at the conservation, reduce the demand or manage the demand level. Just like John is saying, bring some major macro innovation. Just like Neil is saying, we've got to be able to reform the basic system, and not just capitalist organizations, but our not-for-profit organizations, our governmental organizations, our hybrid organizations. And so the answer is that we have to fight a multi-front war, looking at all the components of the system, all the components of the ecosystem, and then be able to have interventions to be able to make improvement and change in all of those elements of the system and ecosystem, and also have them coordinated between and betwixt each other. And Neil made a really important statement. It's having high involvement of all stakeholders.
Yeah.
You've got to get people to understand, like Ted said, I've got a piece of skin in this game. I've got a stake in this, and yes, I'm going to support it.
I agree with everything Peter said, except calling it a war. There's something about that language that just has so many negative connotations. I want to find a better language for it, but I exactly. And the other thing is, we don't know what's going to work. So let's just start a bunch of different experiments at different levels and design our way into the future. We just don't know. And I think working at all levels, there's nothing wrong with being micro. We need micro, we need macro, we need media, we need it all.
We do.
Let me make a bold statement.
Basically, what you're saying is.
Let me make a bold statement for all of you. Capitalism is dead. And why do I say capitalism is dead?
Hang on here. So basically, what you said is sort of like, let's start somewhere, and we kind of build the parachute as we're going down, Neil. Is that what you're saying?
Let's start everywhere. I mean, start literally.
Yes, it does. But here's the complexity. But here's the thing, though, that I've observed. So I worked for many years as an in organizational transformation, and what I noticed was that we have generally there is a real need for thinking more interconnected, and that's also, you know, for you at home, maybe you can follow us on this one. It really is for starting to take a systems perspective, and part of the problem is that in the society that we have right now, systems thinking is so small and so little that even in an organization, it's hard to find people that can actually see an organization from all different stakeholder perspective and the larger point of view. So the mindset and education, I think, are also huge things that need to be tackled.
That's absolutely true. The mindset and education is absolutely core and absolutely critical to this. And so we have to build mechanisms into our educational institutions to do that.
Exactly.
So as a result of the rancor that we have in politics, I think what we need to do is teach civics in junior high school and high school as a result of the pandemic and people not understanding science and epidemiology and virology. We need anatomy and physiology. We need basic science in our education so that people become literate on this stuff. And to go back to what Ted was saying, we need basic literacy from the time you're a child, understanding how I in my home can reduce my carbon footprint.
Yeah.
And the children, if we teach them that, will help keep us as parents and grandparents a little bit more honest in how we behave individually at the micro level in our homes. So yes, I mean, I teach adjunct in a university, in an engineering school, and I'm just shocked sometimes in my university environment how little people who are educated with bachelor's degrees do not understand the political environment, the governance environment of our country and of our states and of our cities.
Yep.
It's a serious problem.
Yes, and then when you put this to energy, which is so complex in context to sustainability, that really gets us into very thin water. I want to talk a little bit about alternatives. So, John, we want to hear from you a little bit about what exactly it is. Tell us about your invention, an overview.
Okay, well, I retired from Marathon Oil Company at 50 years old. And when I retired, I decided I was going to work on generating energy from river flow. The reason why I picked river flow, it's the most dense form of energy that you can capture on the planet. So for last 15 years, I've worked on it. The first 12 years, we had a failure as far as being able to generate a huge amount of energy. 12 years into it, we had a very large breakthrough. It's based on kinetic energy from river flow. And for me to, I don't want to go through all the details, but what I've done is I've decided to create a United Nations challenge. And that United Nations challenge states this, that I can generate 100,000 terawatts of electricity worldwide. Now, today the world generates 7 terawatts of electricity worldwide. Okay? I put that out there just because I wanted to show the extreme capabilities of this new energy invention. We'd never contemplate that. I also state within that United Nations challenge that I can show the engineers around the world that we can generate energy for 5% of the cost of wind and solar. 5% of the cost. And 20 to 30% of the cost of any energy generation technology that exists, fossil fuels or not. Now that challenge states that, and that I also state that I can prove that from the engineering, the prototype, and the 3D drawings and other materials that we have already completed. So there's no reason to do a prototype to show them or anything else. And if we cannot pass that challenge, then we're willing to give up the rights to the new energy invention and close the company down. Now, I was invited to the United Nations to give a speech. I gave a speech to a small group of people. They played politics the whole time. So when I left there, I decided I'll put out this challenge and that we stand behind that challenge. Now, the United Nations knows about it. The Secretary General friended me on Facebook of all places and have sent me messages. But we need to bring the world together and let me fulfill that challenge because I know we can. What am I asking for? I'm asking for patent protection around the world. Why do I want patent protection? Not to make me rich. If I don't make a penny on this, I could less care. It's to help poor countries and rebuild a middle class around the world and benefit mankind going forward. Now, this is real. I'm here on TV telling this challenge. I'm willing to stand behind it. I have no problems whatsoever. Now, when I talk about generating energy for 5% of cost of wind and solar, I really mean that. Wind and solar are intermittent energy. You cannot get rid of the old infrastructure because they're not dependable. Even on a cloudy day with solar, the utilities lose money because what happens is every time a cloud goes by, the utility company must maintain a certain base load of energy. There's all kinds of issues. Same with wind. Wind have gust and lows. And our cost is $400 million a gigawatt. So for people that don't understand what a gigawatt is, it's about the average, 2 gigawatts, about the average size nuclear plant. And it's $400 million a gigawatt. That's extremely cheap, and it's for a fraction of the cost of any energy that's out there.
Okay, so gentlemen, I'm going to ask you now, since you've heard that, what's your first reaction? Neil, you want to go at it?
Sorry, that was me?
Yes. What's your reaction?
Bring it on. I mean, anything that gets patented for the public domain, let's just do it. If it's real, fantastic. But the other thing that was going through my mind is, as long as it's linked to what does success, what is this going to enable? More power generation, more manufacturing, more pollution. Again, what's the systems view if we have all this power?
Kinetic energy. Kinetic energy does not.
John, let him finish,
no, I don't mean,
please,
I don't mean just the generation. I mean, okay, so now you can have bigger plants making more stuff. So without changing the demand side and how we think about capitalism, the unintended consequences could be devastating.
Wouldn't it be a nice problem to have too much energy and not enough?
Not
no,
necessarily.
I would agree with Neil.
No,
I think we do need to be very conscious in how we do this. So it has to be all balanced. To me, balance is all the most important thing. Otherwise, everything goes out of balance, and that's what brings us to the problems we're having now because we are so out of balance with most of things. Ted, what's your reaction on this one? Questions you have?
If John has the technology, if he has the wherewithal to bring it, I would agree with Neil. Let's bring it. It's interesting in some of my travels around the planet, sometimes it's a distribution network problem that many people are facing. We're actually at a very, very great position here in the majority of the United States where we have reliable and somewhat affordable energy. That can't be said for a lot of places on the planet. You look at what's going on in Puerto Rico, you look at what's going on in a lot of Caribbean countries right now, they don't have reliable energy 24 hours a day. There are times when the grid just doesn't have enough to supply everyone, even today. I remember driving down the road once, it was August 6th, which is like July 4th in Jamaica. August 6th is their Independence Day. And the president of Jamaica was addressing the country, and he was talking about, we have to move from an agricultural society to an industrialized society. We have to embrace technology. And I'm driving down the road and I'm seeing these huts that didn't have electricity nor running water. And I'm like, this is like a leap a little bit too far right now. There's some basics in blocking and tackling that need to take place. And I'm sure that a lot of these areas would benefit from the technology that John is describing, as well as necessarily bringing in a wider distribution network so that you can have reliable and affordable energy 24 hours a day.
Pete, your take, your reaction? Feedback?
Well,
thoughts?
my reaction is, again, because I teach in a school of engineering, I say, okay, John, let's set up some prototypes, let's put it in, let's test it, let's fund it, let's make this thing happen and prove out the technology and then run with it.
But you've got the tests, right, John?
Peter, I state in my United Nations claim, I can prove this from the materials that already exist. I don't need to build another prototype or set up a prototype. You don't build a large building and then say, well, now you've proven you can build the large building. The engineering's sound, the engineering disciplines behind it. And the only thing and it's too important to put out in a small piece, because what happens is it'll be corrupted, exploited. And you talked about people around the world being able to use this. The idea is that we collect royalties from wealthier countries and fund these projects in poorer countries to create a much more balanced and world, not only with cheap energy. And I also look at it as replacing oil, more importantly than replacing electricity. Oil for transportation, 98% of transportation is oil-based. It's a way that we get off oil permanently. Now, the idea that I have to prove this, that's why I created the United Nations Challenge in the first place.
John, your idea may have merit. I would have to look at it in more detail to be able to decide it. But what I'm telling you is that my work historically has been much of it involved with creating innovation and scaling innovation. And so, I again come from at least one part of me from an academic environment. And in academia, my colleagues in the engineering school say we've got to have prototypes, we've got to demonstrate effectiveness, and your conviction is not adequate. It's good. I'm glad you have conviction, but we've got to be able to prove out that this actually can work. And the degree to which you refuse to do that will limit the degree to which this can be effectively implemented.
Peter, I'm not against that at all. I said if United Nations are a large enough body to protect the patents around the world, will step up and help me protect these patents and create a partnership around then I will show the world. I mean, no money's involved. I've never asked for a penny during this entire 15-year existence, by the way, and I still haven't. I don't owe anybody 1 cent. I'm not asking for any money today. I'm asking for a partnership to protect the patents. Otherwise, the minute I show this, it will be exploited around the world. The corrupt patent system and everything else around the world will not allow me to take those royalties and help poor countries around the world. And that's where I stand. So the idea that I need to show you, I'm sorry, Peter, but I don't need to show you. I'm willing to show the whole world at once in front of the United Nations, and it's without asking for a penny. So the idea that that I have to completely try to explain to people how this operates, I don't need any of that. I'm not asking for any money. What's the risk reward? Power the entire planet? Probably the survival of the human race depends on it. Or, a few lawyers' time to set up a partnership that 99.9% of the engineers around the world believe can't work. I feel like Christopher Columbus, they're trying to explain to the king and queen over there that the world isn't flat.
All right, so on one thing we all agree going forward, we need to revolutionize our approach to energy, so to speak. So in this last segment, believe it or not, we have about 14 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about more in terms of the change that needs to happen in society and how we approach energy. What's the most pressing thing that needs to happen? Ted, you want to start with that? What do you see as the most important thing that needs to happen?
I think there's a mindset out here that believes, that this is a zero-sum game. One of the quotes that I read when this disaster happened in Texas last week was that, they talked about, all of this renewable energy and stuff. They said it's the climate dreams of the coastal elites. The climate dreams of the coastal elites. And I go to conferences all over the country to talk about sustainable energy. And the stunning thing is that when we take attendance, you have a lot of people from the East Coast and a lot of people from the West Coast, and unfortunately, not very many people from the middle of the country. And we think that, okay, is there a resistance to this? Is there the thought that this is some sort of zero-sum game, and that means there are winners and there are losers? And I think there's a mindset that has to change. Clearly, what we have for us will not work. I think everyone on your panel tonight has conceded that what we're doing today is not sustainable down the road.
Yep.
This is not the planet that we should leave for our children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
And so the thought that all of us aren't coming together to talk about solutions is deeply concerning. I might not have the solution like John has that will save everybody, but I'm willing to at least come to the table and hear the thoughts and the intelligence of others. I'm not smart enough to think that I have all the answers myself, but I find a lot of people even resistant to come to the table and start having the discussion. And that's what is concerning to me first and foremost. So when you talk about what needs to change, first we got to change the minds out here.
So openness to discuss solutions.
I think secondarily, that the change, and again, I'm sorry, I'm a kind of a micro sort of dude. I admit it. I've lived in the District of Columbia my entire life.
But remember, we talked about, Ted, we talked about having all stakeholders on the table. That's why we need the micro and the macro. So go ahead.
And I don't see enough people of my color in these conversations either.
That's right.
And I don't see this as a racist problem. This isn't a black-white problem. Everybody else, everybody has the same problem. Yeah. Everybody. Yeah. What happened in Texas didn't discriminate based along racial lines. I mean, this is not a black and white or brown or male and female. This is all of us are in this. And I think all of us need to come together and start talking about it.
And Trent, we're going to need 1 million of micro people to make this work, even if they accept my new energy invention. This world is huge, and it needs a lot of effort. And Peter, I'd like to apologize to you. I wasn't meaning to direct that at you, so I'd like to apologize to you on air.
All right, let's move forward here. Change that needs to happen. Neil, you look like you're ready to go.
Yeah. I can't separate energy sustainability from societal, environmental, social sustainability. So I want to put them together, and I'm hopeful. I just happened to today read Larry Fink's 2021 letter to CEO. Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, $7 trillion under control, and he really kicked off the full purpose-driven stakeholder beyond just shareholders. And he's so direct with the CEO, saying not only is this the right thing to do, but our data shows you enjoy a sustainability premium. That's why People-Powered Innovation Collaborators focuses on businesses and ecosystems, organizations and ecosystems. They have the resources and the capabilities, I think, bring this change about because of their reach, because of just what they have to do. And now we're seeing there's that push to do it. More and more companies are looking at it this way. They're looking sustainable. They will make the changes that make sense for their stakeholders. But the push is there. The investment monies are flowing into these companies that are making these sustainability differences. So I think it's going to happen. And I think it's going to happen one organization, one ecosystem. And then I think it'll start leaking more into government. Because these organizations are going to start demanding new regulations because the old regulations don't work anymore, not for where we're headed. So if Larry Fink's pushing this $7 trillion and he's pushing the CEOs, they listen to him. So I'm hopeful. Again, I'll take the systemic view. You can't separate energy from the rest of the sustainability efforts.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Pete?
You know, John's point that he made earlier was, I've got the technical part of this done, but I think what John is struggling with, if I understand correctly, is the organizational, institutional piece of getting the support from people's support from the legal system in order to be able to bring this to fruition. And I think we could spread that peanut butter around to the whole issue of sustainability and energy. That much of what is problematic is that we have to deal with the organizational, the political, the people side of this in order to be able to get multiple solutions from all different parts of the system moving forward simultaneously. If we look at the situation in Texas as a case example, it's a case example that shows one group of people that took a more systemic point of view, and that's the folks over in El Paso, and another group of people that did not take the systemic point of view, and that's the ERCOT people. And as a result of that, we see success, we see failure. And so using that systemic ecosystem point of view in the Texas example worked better.
I think you're also dealing with, on a large scale here, you have what used to be investor-owned utilities. Many of them still are. Many of them are still vertically integrated monopolies that have been in existence for over a century. Okay?
Yeah.
I worked for one. And what was good for some of the guys, and they were able to pass those jobs down to their sons and their sons' sons and their nephews, it was a family affair. These were good people. I'm not criticizing. These were good people who had good jobs. And for a century or more, these vertically integrated monopolies have provided very good livings for a lot of people. But you know, there's an old saying that the only thing that is constant is change. You asked about change earlier. And I know all of you guys are old enough to remember that book when it came out, and how much it shook everyone at its foundation. Remember, it was a short book. It's called Who Moved My Cheese?
Yes.
Remember that book?
Speak for yourself about age.
Okay, all right.
Okay, that has nothing to do with age, I think. A good
Who
book.
Moved My Cheese has got everything to do with change, and how much people freak out at the thought of change. It is frightening
Only when
fundamentally to all of us to think that we have to go through large-scale change.
I'm not sure I can agree with that. I think people don't resist change, they resist being changed. When they're involved in the effort, when they're involved in the change, then it's a very different world.
So there you have it. Change is a gradual process, and as we just heard in the clip, it really is important that all of us, the people, get involved too, so we kind of get all as part of the overall approach. I think there is no question that we all know that we want to go towards a more sustainable future, stop polluting the planet, and stop exploiting resources that none of us really can afford. The question is how to do it. As always, if you do have ideas, suggestions, thoughts about this, reach out to me. The best is you can reach me best on my Twitter handle @ndevidar. I'm not a big Facebooker, so Twitter would be a better option. I look forward to hearing your feedback, your thoughts, your suggestions, your overall approach, also concerns, because I really think it's time for all of us to kind of get together and figure this out as a collective community and in a sense that really takes all of us along on that journey in a way that's doable, feasible, keeps the lights on, and don't sort of take us back to the cave life. Well, there might be some advantages to that, but overall, I think most of us like the comfortable life we've all come accustomed to. In that sense, have a good night and a wonderful week.